you a woodworker in distress? So I'm ready to do the color coat and the distressing. The crackle is good and dry, and in some spots it's barely noticeable that there's anything on there. And it's important when you do the crackle that you have a method so that you don't end up missing a section, because it is difficult to see. So it's important to have the lighting, as I said before, and it's also important as a side note before this step, and in general, it's good not to have any airflow in the environment. So I have the heat turned off, there's no fans on, and it's a simple thing, but it can actually make a big difference in this step, because the timing of the paint drying is a critical factor, and especially with a light color that dries quickly, any airflow is going to make it 10 times faster, and that can make or break the process, and it will surely make the process more difficult to have the paint dry too quickly, and so it's just important to keep that in mind. So I'm all set up to start painting here, and I'm going to put it on with this here sea sponge, which is pretty well used, and I got my painting palette tray again and another receptacle for paint. So I use a small brush for getting in the corners and crevices that the sponge isn't going to reach. I have to do that first and then go over it with the sponge and kind of do one section at a time based on how quickly the paint is drying. Ideally, and in some cases I can cover a whole piece of furniture this size before I go back and start distressing and tooling the paint, but with the lighter colors and the dry humidity in here, I'll probably have to stop at some point and do some of the distressing with these putty knives that I use. I use 2 of them in pairs, so they're well rounded and sanded on the edges so they don't dig in and chew up the wood, and that does most of the tooling. When the paint dries beyond the point where these are effective, I use the gray abrasive pad, cut them up into little pieces, and then do the final details with this. Sometimes that's not necessary if I can do a good job with the knives, but I often do both. So here we go. So sometimes I use the roller here to apply this color coat, and that's my preferred method for efficient coverage, but being that these tables really aren't that big, I think I can just get them done with the sponge. But sometimes I say that and then it's like, oh, you know, this would be so much faster with the roller. The roller does get good reach inside spaces, and I don't know, maybe I should use it. Alright, fine, I'm just going to use the roller. I can never make up my mind. But I'm going to start the process by painting the bottoms, which have been covered with the base coat, but I like to get the color coat. Well, actually, no, I'll do that later. Yeah. I'll do the drawers. That's what I'm going to do. Sometimes getting started is the hardest part. Some thick paint. So, an additional note, now that I decided to roll the paint on, I'm using an additional piece of scrap material here as an additional palette to control the loading of the paint in the roller, because there's not much surface area here inside the tray to squeegee all the paint out, so I need another surface, and that controls the paint and prevents me from putting on too heavy of a coat, which you don't want to do. You want to put on a thin, even coat, and that way you'll get the best results with the crackle. So you can see the crackling effect taking place. So this is the section I started with. So you can see it's flashed over, and this is the last one. So I went in this direction here. So you want the paint to chip off without smearing. That's the key factor. So some spots might still be too wet. I go over the outside corners first because they dry faster, just to get it started. So the paint starts to gum up on the knife, and this is why I use two. So I gotta put the camera down. But I have to use the other knife to clean the knife I'm using, so my test samples are pretty much done at this point to show the effect of the crackle. And as you can see, where I applied a thick coat of the crackle, you get wider cracks and more color contrast. And where I applied a thin coat of crackle, I get finer details in the cracks, and it's not as distracting to the eye. And this is typically the effect that I go for with the furniture finishing. It gives me the ability to tool all the paint on the edges, but it's not as distracting as the wider cracks. You can see that there's quite a bit of difference here. And if I'm doing a heavier distressed look, this is appropriate, but it's more difficult to control. As you can see, I got some paint smear in that area, and that's because that's what happens when you try to work with the paint before it's ready. It'll just kind of smudge onto the base color. And so it's important to note that a big influencing factor of the crackle is the surface quality that you're painting over. I got some wider cracks in this area where I had a knot, and that's because the knot is more dense and it soaks up less of the crackle product. And it's important to note that because what you're painting over makes a big difference. This is new material with one coat of primer, so it's rough on the surface and it soaks up a lot of the product. If I'm doing this type of finish on a refinishing job where I apply the primer over an existing finish that's already smooth and sealed, I'll get a completely different effect, and it's almost impossible to get these finer cracks doing it that way. You can only get a heavier distressed look because the surface is just going to be too smooth to produce the fine cracks. So important to note that, and one of the reasons why I try to stay away from refinishing jobs, because it makes the whole process a lot more difficult to control. So, but as I predicted, all three of these products that I tested produced pretty much the same result. I couldn't even tell a difference between these two products. It might be the exact same thing, but you know, it doesn't really matter what kind of product you use, I guess. But I had some comments that you can make your own crackle using white glue, and I've tried that before. I don't recommend it because there's additives that are in these products that make it more workable with a brush, and unless you want to invest in chemicals and start mixing a whole bunch of stuff, it's really not practical or effective to make your own crackle. I don't recommend it. Spreading glue with a brush is not that easy, so, and that makes a big difference in the effect that you get. So this is $8, this is $25. This will probably last at least a couple years. You don't need much of this product to do the effect that you want. So at this point, my end tables are going to get cleaned up and they're ready to varnish when the paint is more dry. I can do a techniquing glaze that gives it a more antique look. It's just a brown dirty coat that goes over the paint, and sometimes I do that. For this job I'm not going to do it because this color was specified and I don't want to change the color, and it's supposed to look light and distressed. But if I'm doing a heavier distressed, I can do the glaze. I can do a tutorial. That's a different technique working with that for another video. But just wanted to show the crackle and how to apply the paint and the different effects. So hope you enjoy the video, and buy my cutting board feet. Joe approves.